Hello. Is the audio okay?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you, we can see you.
And can you see the slides?
Not yet. Now we
There they
can.
are. Awesome. That was pretty smooth. So, yeah, what I'll be talking about today is the good enough quality horizon. This is not necessarily something new, but it's something that I think is actually upon us, whereas in the past it was more speculative. So, let's cover the boring stuff. I'm Bas Hamer. I build software tools. I'm originally Dutch. I live in the US these days. I've worked 15 years in the software development in a number of different roles. And I actually went into quality after a whole bunch of software development experience, which is not normal for what people usually end up doing. So it's given me a bit of a different perspective. It's also given me a different way to solve some of these problems. And what we're going to talk about is just set up some baselines so people understand what we're talking about from a terminology. Then we'll cover some ancient history, which is like the last 20 years, and then we'll actually talk about what the horizon implies for all of us. And even though we may care a lot about quality because nobody wants to encounter a bug, but businesses care about quality because defects have costs, right? For a business, it's really about how often do we have these things happen, how long do they stay out there, and what's kind of the cost per transaction we're looking at, because this is really where a business starts to worry about defects. And that also means that at some point there's going to be a point where the incidence rate or the duration or the cost all go down enough, or any of them go down enough, that people no longer feel the need to spend more. And that really is the quality horizon. So let's talk about some ancient history. 1996, sorry for the grainy chart. This is the best image I could find. But then again, back in 1996, this was probably pretty good resolution. This is Steve McConnell. Steve McConnell has done a bunch of research into software development. And the key thing that he observed at around that time, right? So this is just before the dot-com boom, or as the dot-com boom started taking off, is that a lot of companies were spending a lot of time, but they were not very efficient with their time spent compared to how many defects they were removing. Right? That's another way to say it, is that the way people develop software just wasn't very good. And this is a bit more academic, but there's this other thing, the Joel test, which from 2000. If people worked during the dot-com boom, you probably saw this get shared. It was a blog post back in the day. Um, most companies back then had like a 2 or a 3. This is how many of these boxes they checked. And this was like simple things, right? Do you use source control? Can you make a build in one step? Do you make daily builds? Do you have a bug database? Do you fix bugs before writing new code? Do you have an up-to-date schedule? Right? There's all of these things that these days are no longer as big of a deal. And the reason for that is that we have things like GitHub, which provides us 5 of these things out of the box for free. Right? Back in 2000, people would score like a 2 or a 3. And today, a bootcamp graduate on their projects scores a 5. We're writing software very differently, right? Because any modern toolchain just gives you half the list, right? You don't have to use GitHub. You can use any Bamboo or anything else. It's just available. And if you do a little bit more, then getting to a 12, which was back then like, oh, aspirational, is like attainable. Um, and the other thing is that these days people are using frameworks, packages, and containers. Like back from Brooks, who wrote the Mythical Man Month, we've always had this concept of buy versus build. But a lot of organizations had a very difficult time actually executing on buy versus build. And the reason for that was that the process of buying software was very difficult. But now with all these frameworks and packages and entire containers you can download on Docker, we now have the ability to just download all of the stuff for free. And free seems to work pretty well for companies. I'm getting some issues with things being grainy. Is that still an issue? I know that the one image was grainy, but I can probably muck with my video settings. Let me reduce the video resolution, and that might help out. Okay, let me see if this makes it better with streaming data. Hopefully the fonts will become better in a little bit as well. All right. Unfortunately, this is not going to be easy to fix, so I'll be making sure to talk through things. Okay, the other thing that has changed is standardization. There's a typo in there. Anyway, one of the first jobs out of college, I was responsible for ensuring that our build machine was available for future patches. And the way we did that was we would create a build machine, which is a physical piece of hardware, and then we would shrink wrap it and put it in a vault. The actual hardware, the box. And we made the improvement to go to, a backup of the hard drive on CDs going into a vault. Right? That level of standardization has been continuing all along. And the virtual machines came out, right? Infrastructure as code. People will just tear down and stand up machines. And all of these things have just made it go much smoother when it comes to software development. It hasn't been like overnight. It's taken a lot of time, but the differences are there. And what's really happened, and this image is grainy again, is that a lot of these companies that were really up on the left-hand side have migrated towards this point where people are much more efficient and then are able to deliver things in a very efficient manner. And this has been gradual. Right? This hasn't been like any one thing that really has gotten us there. It is over time, things keep improving and all of these different things are contributing. The next thing to talk about is duration. Duration has had massive differences as well. And this is the second factor of the cost for businesses on these defects. So, back in 2000, SneakerNet, right? If you wanted to install a patch, well, that probably meant you had to burn a CD. That CD had to be transported to people, and then you were able to install it. A patch would take weeks, right? Internet speeds were really bad back then. If you had ISDN, that was like kind of exciting, but these days, it's very different. So we've had a lot of changes here, right? We were looking at weeks. First downloadable patch, 2002. Windows automatic updates, 2000. Things started becoming something like days. Okay, much better. Automation, continuous integration, continuous delivery, zero downtime deployment. People are able to now ship a patch in hours. And there's people who will leverage this as a way to mitigate investment in quality, right? Because if things break, but you're able to recover very fast, well, then that also reduces the cost. And over time, things have just sped up drastically. And now we have people who are doing canary releases, feature toggles, and A/B testing, and they're able to correct a mistake in minutes, if not seconds, which again reduces your costs. And then, of course, the App Store showed up and we're back up to date. So it's not all progress, right? If you are working with things in the App Store, then you know that if you need to get approval for a patch, you're looking at a day or 2 days. More than that, you're kind of unlucky, but most people within 2 days you can get it done, which again means that the cost goes up if that is your industry, or at least the duration of the defects goes up. And then the last part is the cost per transaction. So first of all, canary releases, feature toggles, and A/B testing show up again because they limit your exposure. Rather than being able to, ship a release and it goes to everyone at once, now you can ship a release and it goes to a few people. And you can take a look at it, like how does it perform? Are we happy with the outcomes? If not, well, then let's stop doing it. And roll it back, right? So we can limit the exposure, which again reduces that cost. Microservices, this is the Amazon website for a Christmas tree. Um, you've all looked at the Amazon website. There's lots of different parts to it, and you realize that chances are each of those parts is being serviced by one particular thing. Well, some of these things have different SLAs than others. Right? If people can't buy a Christmas tree, that's a big problem because you're not making money. On the other hand, if people can't see other sellers on Amazon, but they can still just buy the default, well, it might have regulatory issues, but it's not nearly as important. If you can't load the thing that sells you what's been frequently bought together, it has real cost. And at the scale of Amazon, that can be a very high cost. But again, not as important as being able to just add this thing to your cart or buy it now. So, what's been happening over time as people have started decomposing their monoliths is that whereas before a failure would be like, our website is down, now a failure is this flow doesn't work. Right? And the more people are decomposing and the easier that becomes and easier it is to support that, we reduce the actual impact of our failures. And the last thing that's more recent, well, it's become more popular recently, is message queuing, right? And if you have something like Kafka, where your messages always stay around and you can reprocess your messages, you have the opportunity to actually recover from a defect. That is something that wasn't an option before, right? The idea of like, oh, we released some bad code. Let's just run the code again on the queue of messages and correct our mistakes. Right? That kind of concept wasn't available for most people. But now there's organizations that start to find this to be attainable. And all that combined has meant that the cost of a defect, as far as the organization is concerned, has cratered. Right? We recover faster. We are much better at preventing them from going into the production process at all. And we are able to minimize the impact of these defects as far as how many people are actually impacted by it. And to be clear, the median cost of a defect has cratered. Right? The most expensive defects has skyrocketed. It's bonkers. But a lot of these issues that people have, they're not nearly as serious anymore. That's not to mitigate that there have been really serious issues. And that's kind of the horizon point, right? Where the cost of defects has dropped enough that for some companies, further improvements in quality are no longer warranted. Right? Why spend more on something when it's good enough already? And that's where things become a little bit different. Right? So what happens after that point? Right? Well, it doesn't make spend more money, which of course means some business people are like, but does it make sense to spend less money? Right? And the other thing is that if you have further improvements in quality because you go to some standardized deployment or something else, that might mean that you've come to the point where you might, as an organization, be spending too much on it, or people will see an opportunity to save money. And this is not unique to software, right? If you bought furniture, like flat pack furniture from whatever vendor, you probably figure out like there's going to be extra parts in here, right? If I'm supposed to have 15 dowels, there's going to be 16 in there because they know there's a chance that they don't put enough in, and rather than having to deal with, somebody calling, we'll just add some extras to cover our bases. Whereas other companies work differently, like Legos, for instance. You're not going to get extra parts. They are very good at making sure the right parts go into the box. Same thing with coffee shops. I'm sure people have seen some of the memes of orders that go to Starbucks of like horribly complicated things. But Starbucks is also one of the organizations that kind of can handle something that complicated. Whereas your corner coffee shop will probably stare at you and go like, no, we don't even want to bother to support that because the chance of it not going right is just too high. Like this idea of our quality is good enough is all over the physical world. It's just that in software, we've not really had the luxury of getting there. And that's the question of like, well, are we there yet? Is your organization there yet? Well, should you be looking at to figure out if this is something you have to worry about or consider? Well, first of all, what's the maximum cost of a defect, right? If you shoot things into space and things go wrong, then that's very high. But also if you have like something that goes to the app store, chances are it's going to be more expensive. The next thing is, what's your company culture, right? Like, are you a company that puts a lot of pride into their software development, or are you a company that reluctantly is a software development company? And I imagine this one might be grainy as well. But the idea is that if you look at reviews for like pizza restaurants, you'll find ranges all over the place with how many stars they have. Just because a pizza restaurant doesn't have 4 point whatever stars doesn't mean they're not successful. It just means that they have a different business model. It might be more about the location and the availability, that people will just put up with the fact that the pizza isn't as good or the orders are not as accurate. Right? So, what's your company culture? Do you really put a lot of pride into your perfection? If the answer is no, well, then chances are that you're going to hit this point where further investment is no longer worth it, is a lot higher. And the last thing is your customers, right? If you have customers that are very demanding or very vocal, then that can escalate the cost of your defects in ways that were not really feasible before, right? If you ship a bad release and some Reddit topic somewhere starts a fire, that's really unfortunate. So that in those particular cases, you really have to keep in mind, okay, how are we going to mitigate this, and do we have to invest more just because our customers are more demanding? If you have high-end customers, they will also be a lot more demanding, and acquiring those customers can also be very expensive, so losing them is a big problem. And so you really have to consider all of these different factors in your organization before you want to start thinking about, okay, are we to the point where we can start talking about our quality is good enough? And if our quality is good enough, how do we move forward with this in mind? All right, so what changes? What changes when we go beyond this horizon, right? And the biggest thing that's going to change is your conversations. How you talk about quality is going to be a very different conversation than you're used to. And that's going to have a lot of impacts. Right? Because what we're talking about here is a holistic outcome. It is, what is the actual impact to our customers for the practices we've had in our entire software delivery pipeline, including like how many people were affected, what has been the impact to our customers, were we able to remedy it with the customers, send them a gift card or whatever. Um, like, what is the whole picture look like? Whereas that's not really what we've been talking about in the past. And that's not what our reports are set up for. That is not what we focus on. What we look on at normally is defects. Right? And we're no longer talking about defects. We're kind of saying like defects going to production is fine because of the speed it buys the organization and the efficiencies it buys the organization. If you can recover from a defect going to production and the impact is low, well, then catching the defect, the value of that just goes down. And most defects are caught these days just because of modern development practices. Now, this is going to be, easy to say, but if you look at your arsenal of tools you have and the reports they generate, none of them talk about this, right? They talk about defects, they talk about passing tests, they talk about test coverage, they talk about all the nitty gritty bits that assume you want zero defects. And this is different, right? Now we're talking about zero defect is no longer something we're looking for. We're looking at the quality is good enough. We don't want to break our core business flows, right? We don't want to just ship bad code. But on the other hand, we also are having a different conversation that is not focused around coverage and defects, we're talking now about what is the impact to our customers of the whole process that we have going on. The other thing is to reflect on your current practices, right? And this is painful, right? Because all of us really care about quality. That's why we're in this field. Right? We have this ability to care about the abstractness of software quality. And that means that we really want there to be no defects. And we put a lot of time and effort in certain test suites that are catching some of these little niche cases, and those can be really expensive and hard to maintain. And those might not be the things we should be spending our time and effort on anymore. Right? Those might be the things that go onto the chopping block. Right? Having some integration tests that ensure that our core business flows are covered, great. But these integration tests are expensive. And if we have a whole bunch of these expensive tests that we are maintaining, and we're doing all these niche things that just don't really have a lot of impact, and if they break, the cost isn't very high, and we're able to recover very fast, and we have an understanding with those customers that we have these features for you, they're just going to be a little bit more fragile, but they're not mission critical. That's where you have a very different set of things that are valuable in ensuring your quality. And that might mean that some of these tests you spent a lot of time on, you've invested a lot in, are not going to be worth maintaining. And that's painful. Like, I've been at this position before, and it's super frustrating. It's super painful because you put a lot of time and effort into it, and you realize it's no longer needed because we went to automated deployments in the cloud from having people install stuff on their local machines. Like, a change like that just collapses the complexity so far that it wasn't making sense to maintain some of these difficult integration tests. Next thing to be aware of, side effects. We are moving the costs in this setup. And what we're saying is that we can save money on testing because we have more investment in DevOps, because we have more investment in our A/B testing practices and all these different things. That is important, but it's also no longer intuitive. Because if you're relying on those practices and those practices falter, then that means that more of the pressure is being put onto QA again. And like, that's why when you're at this point where you think you might be there, be cautious, because if for some reason there's some turnover in your DevOps team or in your site reliability folks, or you no longer have the A/B testing going on that you had before because there was a consultant involved in that. Like, if any of those things stop happening, that's a setback, and you might be back to the point where, like, no, we can't recover fast enough anymore. We have to invest more in testing. And that's very complicated. And that's also something that's going to be very difficult to communicate to management, especially if they're not software developers. And that's challenging because those are not conversations you've had to have in the past. And we're going to have to practice how to explain the interrelationship between these different practices to the business. Right now, everybody's trying to hire developers, but all of us have also been in the industry when there were layoffs, right? If there are layoffs that hit some of these different sections that you're relying on to be able to recover from defects very quickly, and you can't do that anymore, well, then that means that effectively they got rid of that, but they also hit the quality of the overall product. I have had some of these conversations, but mostly with people who are fairly technical. And I think that it's going to be very difficult to have these conversations with people who are not technical. So the best thing I can advise here is to start practicing, to be aware that these conversations are going to start coming in your future. And when these conversations start happening in the future, make those learning opportunities and spend a lot of time on them, because if you're going to be in quality for the next decades, or in software development in the next decades, there's going to be more and more companies that are going to get to this point, that are going to realize they're at this point, and they're going to put a different set of expectations on you going forward. But on the same token, be patient, right? Don't don't look at this and say like, wow, we can save a bunch of money because, I think our quality is good enough. When you abandon a practice or tests or something like that, setting it back up is usually not as easy as flipping a switch, right? People like to say code rots. And that's apt. When tests are not being looked at, over time, they're all going to fail. Things are going to change enough that they start failing. And that is something that you have to keep in mind. So if you look at this and say like, well, can we get rid of these really expensive integration tests by leveraging these other technologies? Yes, over time, if you get to this point, if you have the practice, if you're comfortable at it. But I wouldn't get rid of those tests quite yet, because if you find out like, hey, yeah, we adopted, we changed the business model a little bit, we found some new customers, they're very expensive customers, they have high expectations, well, then that meant you just moved the needle a bunch, and you might find like, no, we really do need these integration tests to be in place, because if they're not in place, we're going to have problems with our quality being good enough. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you really want to look at a long period of time, right? You don't look at, is the quality good enough of our next release? Because not all releases are made equal. Some releases are just some additional, toggles on some existing features, whereas some releases have entire new features, whereas some releases will have entire new business flows. Those things are not made equal. You're going to have to look at a very long perspective, and you may want to, err on the side of patience. One of the things that I like to talk to people about, or ask people when they start talking about topics like this, is to say, if your test passed today, are you fine closing your eyes and shipping the thing to production? And if the answer to that is yes, well, then they might be at the point where this becomes something worth talking about, right? Because they have the confidence in the whole process to be there, to be able to handle bad things when if they do manage to sneak through, and knowing that enough of it doesn't sneak through. If you're not there yet, then get to that point first before you start looking at how to make your interactions around quality more efficient, and having more of this holistic cost focus of, it's good enough. How can we maintain this good enough point while not spending effectively as little resources on it as possible? All right. I think I rushed through this a little bit. So, does anybody have any questions on this? And again, feel free to reach out to me on either LinkedIn or email as well. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Great talk. That was really, really good. I really enjoyed it. Good enough quality is something that I think aligns really well to things like risk-based testing, and kind of acknowledging, hey, we can't get it all, and perfect software is a myth. So
Yep.
what are we comfortable with?
Yeah, and that's one of the things you'll see, and this is something that happens with a lot of companies, is that as companies mature, what's good enough is going to change.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you have a startup, risk-based testing is what they always do, which is to say they don't test because the risk is you run out of money. So they want to go as fast as possible, which means that if you rely on software from a startup, on occasion it might not be available. Right? It's just the way that things work in those environments. Whereas if these companies become more mature and their customers have different expectations because they didn't buy a product from a startup, they bought a product from a more mature organization, expectations change, right? And that's where you start looking at risks to your reputation, to your customers, and all of these things start to add up and keep changing this picture. So startups, they will hover on both sides of this horizon very quickly until they mature, and then they usually end up on either one side or the other side. Um, it takes a lot of investment to be good enough as software development, as an organization, to get to the point where you can have these conversations and to recognize, yeah, we're good enough, or over there we're good enough, so let's leave that service alone and put our investment somewhere else.
I agree. Um, I also think context is king here. And I know, not everybody buys into the whole context-driven testing thing, but there is a certain amount of context involved because good enough for a medical device isn't the same as good enough for consumer software.
I think that's partially the people who are motivated to be in QA, right? The people who are working in QA are the people who care that things are right. Like, we want things to be right. We want things to be perfect. We care about those things, right? And the business has a different caring.
Mhm.
The business also cares about these things, but not at the exclusion of everything else. Whereas a lot of us, we kind of do care about the quality at the exclusion of everything else. Um, and that's hard, right? Because you're gonna have to bridge this different value framework that you're gonna have and that the business is going to have, and facilitate those conversations. And there's gonna be some give and take in there. Like, we just want things to get better, right? When people work at an organization, they want the quality to improve, and they only focus on like how many defects to go to production. And to be fair, the tools we use tend to make us focus on that too. Whereas now we're gonna have to have conversations and say like, no, 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 it's fine that more defects go to production because it allows us to move faster, and we really care about what's the impact to the customer and what does the impact to the whole organization. And that's difficult, right? Because those are not people who went into quality. These are not the people who care about this, you know, abstraction on top of software, which is already an abstraction, right? The, and that's going to be very difficult for a lot of people in this field. And I wouldn't be surprised if some people are just going to look at it and go like, yeah, no, I'm good. I'll go do something else, right? Because they no longer can scratch that itch that makes them happy working in QA. Right? It is to find every last one of these things and make it perfect, and then being able to be done with it and put it on the shelf and be proud of that. Um, it's going to be difficult.
You know,
Uh,
I wonder, so I have a really interesting like perspective on this. I wonder if we have to kind of rewire ourselves for what gives us that dopamine hit. Because let's be really honest about part of the reason that we enjoy making things perfect. It's that it feels good. Like our brains
mhm.
release all of those feel good hormones and it's that dopamine hit and it's like, "Oh man, it's great. It's perfect. It's amazing." Part of gamification is giving you the dopamine hit for finishing things because it feels good to move the story card. It feels good to cross something off the list. Rewiring our brains to say moving the story card feels better than perfect. It's hard and it takes a mindset
Yes.
shift. And it
Yep.
makes me wonder because now I'm a product owner, having been a tester for 10 years, if we should all take turns. Like, everybody has to take a rotation as product owner for 3 sprints. Like, you get a release cycle as a product owner. You have to see it from the business perspective for a little while, and people would hate it, but I bet they'd learn a ton. I don't know, maybe I should put something
Yes.
together.
No, absolutely true. It's and I think that part of this is for me, I've had my own business.
Mhm.
Um, I started out in development, so I kind of started looking at it from a different perspective to begin with. Um, and that I think that's part of why some of these things that start to annoy me have formed themselves into presentations like this or others. Uh, because yeah, it doesn't feel right. Right? It doesn't feel the way things should be when you're optimizing for your own dopamine consumption, effectively, right? Your personal happiness. Um, Whereas for organizations, it's not about us, which let's be fair, most people in QA realize that the organizations are not about them. It's frustrating, but that's been driven home. But going forward, it's going to be even less about the quality aspects of it, just because of these other practices being put in place and more being adopted. And that's gonna I think you're right. I think there's going to be people have to rewire themselves. People are going to have different perspective. I think that one of the things that's going to be important is that our tooling has to help us communicate with in a way that makes us feel good about the fact that a release went out with defects, right? Because those reports don't exist. The only thing we see is a production defect. We don't see, the fact that this was a release which was budgeted for an X amount of hit, and we are like way under that. Right? The company budgeted for defects costing what's called $5,000, however they calculate that. And instead, we had a release that went out with a defect that cost $50. Well, that's amazing. But we don't see that. We just see that ticket come in and we're like, damn, we missed something. So that's going to be hard. And it's going to be frustrating, to say the
I
least.
and we have a little bit of time, so if you don't mind me, like, exploring this idea with you,
Hmm.
and if you don't want to, I totally understand,
No, go
but
for it.
I wonder if testers getting to be more engaged in things like user experience and measuring user experience and measuring user satisfaction. Not from things like Net Promoter Score, because Net Promoter Score can be really valuable. But like, I worked in insurance for a while. Net Promoter was heavily biased by how somebody felt about their most recent experience with the company, not necessarily with the app. But how do the users feel about the application? And we can measure it in all sorts of ways. And that can balance out those bad feelings, those icky feelings of like, oh man, there was a defect with, oh, but all of these other users are so happy. So like, there was a bad thing, but then there's this really great thing.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that there's a lot more of the good stuff being fed back to the people rather than the bad stuff, if that's applicable. Like because the way we consume information also becomes a challenge then, which is when we think about whether or not we do good or bad. Part of what you do is you use availability bias, which is to say, like you think about positive and negative events recently, and you just tally them up and call it good. Whereas you really want to get that to a point where they are proportional, right? That proportionality, I think, is going to be the bigger challenge to approach, because if you start talking about like, hey, we had a tiny improvement in Net Promoter Score, and we had two defects, then you're like, well, I can think of two defects and I hear that there's a tiny improvement, but we need to kind of get to a point where we can discuss them and put some sort of units on them that allow people to even them out. right? And it doesn't have to be dollars, it can be carrots or whatever else. And you can say like, oh, well, this tiny improvement in user satisfaction is worth 5,000 carrots. And the defects that we found, one of them is a 2-carat one and the other one's a 3-carat one. But again, fantastic results. But again, you may also have defects that could be much more expensive depending on your field. Like you mentioned earlier, medical devices, anything that moves in the real world, drones, shipping stuff to space, self-driving cars, all of those fields have the opportunity for defects that have astronomical costs that are incredibly hard to even predict how high they're going to be. So we're also going to have these long tail events to worry about where you want to shave costs, but are we going to have something go out that wipes out the company? You have
I
to be
think,
aware whether or not that's an option.
yeah, absolutely. And I think what we're kind of dancing around without directly saying it is that this is an organizational culture thing, and it's part of being
Yes.
mission focused. And being a mission driven organization is what gives you the carrots.
Yes.
When you're not mission driven and it's more siloed and we're not all focused on the same goal, we don't get the same result. But this could turn into a huge conversation. So I don't think I want to go down that path right now.
No, I think that's a good observation. Is that this really is something that's only applicable where everybody's nose is pointed in the same direction, and you don't necessarily have a departmental culture, right? Where like, oh, well, this is their pot of money, and this is our pot of money, and I'm part of these people, and they're part of those people. Like when everybody has this clear idea of what the company wants to achieve, it's going to be much easier to focus measuring your progress against that goal rather than focusing your progress against the goal you have available, which quite often is defects.
I agree. Well, Baz, do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with today?
Yeah, I think the only thing to keep in mind is that I think this is something that some companies start hitting now, have been hitting for the last few years, but it's going to become more popular and more prevalent in the next decade. Right? If you have software that's been around for a decade, don't worry about it. This does not apply to you. There, chances are that a lot of decisions were made over the last 10 years that mean that you're just not able to leverage all of these benefits that have happened. But it's going to start creeping into the conversation. And for the people who are going to be the early adopters, it's going to be the hardest, right? Because they're going to have to figure out how to have the conversations, how to create the tools and the reports to bring the business along in this conversation, in this journey, in this transition. So if you think you might be in that category, well, think about it. Look for examples in real life and see how you can leverage those things. Or talk to people who work in other industries to see how they have those conversations, right? Talk to your pizza delivery driver if you want to. Like, how do you guys handle it when things go wrong, and what's okay and what's not okay, and how in the end do you make decisions as to we have to change something or we don't?
Yeah, I like it. Well, thank you so much. That was a great talk, and it was so nice getting to chat with you and dig a little deeper.
Gladly. Thank you for facilitating.